For many of us, the summer is road trip season. There's just something about the excitement of pulling out of the driveway. Cars packed, suitcases are loaded, the GPS is programmed. And someone is making one last trip inside because somebody forgot something. And before long, someone just smiles and says, "Okay, everyone, let's hit the road." I love that moment. It's that, we finally made it to this point. I just love the anticipation, the possibilities, the feeling that something new is about to begin. But of course, not every road trip goes exactly as planned. See, years ago, a survey asked travelers about their biggest frustrations on vacation. Getting lost ranked as near the top of the list. And I understand that one because getting lost is becoming something of a specialty of mine. You see, I've always discovered, though, that getting lost isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes the best stories begin with a wrong turn. You see, sometimes you discover something you never would have found if everything had gone according to plan. And I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. But thankfully we have the GPS now, right? Technology has made traveling so much easier most of the time. Would you agree to that? Most of the time. But even the best GPS asks you one question. It's that one question before you can even begin this trip. Where are you going? And you have to enter a destination before it can even show you somewhat of a direction. But you know what? I think that's true of every journey. Every journey begins with a destination. Before the car can begin to move, someone has to already know or have decided where they're going. And I think that's true not only for vacations, but also for our faith. So as we begin this series called Road Trip, I want us to think of our lives with Christ as a journey. Not a race, not a checklist, and not simply about arriving somewhere someday, but an actual journey. Because following Jesus has always been more about becoming than simply arriving. And that's exactly where we find the disciples this morning. Matthew tells us that they've traveled to a mountain in Galilee and that Jesus has told them to go. Can you imagine that climb? And perhaps they're wondering, what is it that Jesus has to say to them? And maybe they're replaying everything that had just happened over the last few weeks. The cross, the empty tomb, the astonishing news that Jesus was alive. Nothing about their lives looked the way that it had expected. And when they reached the mountain, Matthew tells us they worshiped. What a beautiful scene, right? They worshiped. But then Matthew adds something, and I love this part that Matthew adds. Some doubted. Think about that. Some doubted. And I love that Matthew leaves these words into the story because really, honestly, if I was editing this gospel, I probably would have left those words out. Why? We're talking about Jesus, right? We should all have it figured out by now. But apparently not. Some worshiped, some doubted. And I really suspect that many were probably doing the same thing at the same time. But honestly, isn't that what faith looks like? We gather to worship, and yet we still carry questions. And honestly, that's faith. And the good news is that Jesus doesn't wait until the disciples have perfect faith before speaking to them. I love that Jesus doesn't say to them, "Come back when you figured it all out, then we can talk." No, Jesus meets them exactly where they are, with all their faith, with all their questions, their doubts. And you know what? Jesus meets us like that here today. And then we're told then Jesus says something remarkable to them. He says, go. Or as some biblical scholars point out, that the phrase can be understood as you are going. So think of it in today's terms, as you go home, as you return to your neighborhoods, as you return back to work, as you live your everyday lives. Remember, keep following me and let the journey change you. You see, Jesus wasn't simply giving the disciples an assignment, perhaps. Jesus was giving them a future. Because you see, the mountain wasn't the destination. It was the trailhead. Now, if you've gone hiking, you know what a trailhead is, right? It's where the journey begins. You don't get to drive to the trailhead, take a picture of the sign, and then turn around and go back home, because the trailhead exists for one purpose: to begin the hike. And that's exactly what this mountain was. The disciples may have thought that they reached the end of their journey, but Jesus knew that they were standing at the beginning. Because you see, the resurrection wasn't the finish, it was the trailhead. And Jesus didn't gather the disciples on the mountain so they could stay there. No. Jesus gathered them so they could leave. Sounds silly, doesn't it? Come up here so you can leave. But you see, the truth is sometimes we treat church like that. We treat church like the destination. And if the goal is simply just to get here on Sunday morning, well, you succeeded. But you see, the church has never been the destination. The church is the trailhead. It's where we gather together. It's where we worship together. And this is where we're reminded whose we are. And this is where we're encouraged. And then we're sent. Go. Go back onto the road. Because that's where Jesus continues shaping us. That's where the journey really begins. And I think one of the greatest surprises of following Jesus is that we rarely recognize how much we've changed in the middle of the journey. You see, it isn't usually until we stop and look back that we realize how far we've really come. And road trips, they just have a way of teaching us that. We spend weeks planning this destination. We map the route. We reserve the hotel. We decide what attractions it is that we want to see. But years later, when someone asks about the trip, it usually isn't the destination that they remember. It's those unexpected moments along the way. I remember taking a family vacation years ago to Gatlinburg, Tennessee. The downtown area was fun. We loved riding on the trolleys. We loved going into the shops. The restaurants were really good. And all the attractions that made Gatlinburg such a popular place to visit. We loved it. But if you ask me today what I remember most about the trip, it wouldn't be any of those things. It was something that wasn't even planned, wasn't even on our agenda. One afternoon, my dad, sister, and I were riding around, just kind of checking out the sights, and we saw this roadside trail, and Dad pulled over and says, let's try it. Let's see what happens. And somewhere along the way, we made a wrong turn, and I know it's my sense of direction, but I wasn't the lead on that one. I won't take the credit for that one, but we made a wrong turn, and that turn, it led us somewhere I'll never forget. I'll never forget what we saw. You see, we walked into this beautiful clearing. It was all green. All you saw was just green, lush, green. The ground was green. Everything was green. But in the middle of all that green, it was the clearest, bluest lake that I've ever seen. It was almost like it wasn't real. And someone tied a rope made a rope swing from a tree and had it hanging from a tree and whatnot. And there was people that were swinging across this lake. And it looked like something from a postcard. We all just stood there in awe. It was like you didn't want to say nothing because you didn't want to break it. You know, the sight of that, it was just that beautiful. And we stayed there much longer than we had even planned. And even now, years later, and I'm talking many, many years ago this happened, I can still just picture that place place of serenity. And I couldn't even tell you what restaurant we went to that night. And I don't even remember the souvenirs that we brought home from that trip. I imagine it was a t-shirt, but I really can't be for sure. But I still remember that spot, that hidden lake. It wasn't a destination. It wasn't even on the itinerary, but somehow it became the moment that shaped how I remembered that whole trip. And as I reflected over the years, I realized that God often works the same way, right? We spend so much of our lives looking ahead. We often think or even say things like, when I finally get through this, when I retire, or when things aren't quite so busy. And we keep thinking that life and faith will really begin once we finally arrive. But God has a way of meeting us on the road. And sometimes in places that we never intended to go. And sometimes in conversations we never expected to have. Or even sometimes in the seasons that we would have never chosen for ourselves. But yet, when we look back, we discover those unexpected moments become the very places where Jesus was shaping us. And I remember, if that's what the disciples realized, standing on that mountain, they probably couldn't see how much they've changed, but think about who they were before Jesus found them. They were ordinary people, right? They had no idea where following Jesus was going to lead them. And over the next 3 years, they walked dusty roads together. They watched Jesus touch people whom everyone else avoided. They listened as Jesus welcomed their society pushed aside. And they learned that love was bigger than fear. Hope was powerful than death. And they didn't learn those things sitting in a classroom. They learned them by walking the road with Jesus. And maybe that's why Jesus doesn't ask them if they're finally ready. No, Jesus doesn't ask that. Have you figured it out already? Do you have all the answers now? No, Jesus simply sends them. Go. Because Jesus knows something we often forget. We don't become faithful before we begin the journey. We become faithful because we keep walking with Christ. And we do it one step at a time. And that's true for every one of us. When we first begin following Jesus, we don't know what the journey is going to be. What's before us? But yet, we still keep on walking. And if we keep trusting and if we keep paying attention, we start to discover something beautiful. The road isn't just somewhere taking us somewhere. The road is making us into someone. And that's what Jesus was doing with the disciples. And that's what Jesus is still doing with us today. And that's why I think Jesus' final words are so beautiful. And everything the disciples had experienced, after all their questions, after all their fears, after all their failures, Jesus simply says, as you are going. In other words, keep walking, keep growing, keep trusting, keep sharing life you've discovered. For years, I've heard the words, go and make disciples. Have you really listened to those words? Go and make disciples. I just imagine Jesus handing the disciples this impossible assignment. Go change the world. Go convince everyone you meet, and go have all the answers. That's all I could think of. But the longer I've walked with Christ, the more I think Jesus is inviting us into something much simpler. Think about your favorite road trip. Where have you been? What made it memorable? Was it really the destination? Or was it the people who traveled beside you? Because some of my favorite memories have little to do with where we were going. And looking back, what made those trips unforgettable wasn't the destination. It was the people who shared the journey with me. And I think that's what Jesus is inviting the disciples to discover. Faith was never meant to be a solo road trip. And that's why Jesus gathered a community. That's why the disciples traveled together. And that's why the church exists today. Not because we've all arrived, but because we're still traveling together. And you see, that's one of the things I love about Green Valley. Every Sunday, and I can say, yeah, every Sunday I see people helping one another. I see someone greeting a first-time guest with a genuine smile. It isn't fake, it's genuine. And I see someone sitting beside a friend who's carrying grief. The beauty is I see people praying for others after worship. Those moments rarely make the church newsletter, I'll be honest. And they don't even really receive applause. But I have a feeling that those are exactly the kinds of moments that Jesus had in mind. Because that's how the journey continues. The journey doesn't end with us. And as Jesus shapes our lives, we naturally begin inviting others to walk the road with us. But here's the good part about that. We walk these roads, but you know what? We don't have to be experts. We don't have to have it all figured out. But because we've discovered something beautiful, we don't have to keep it to ourselves. And that's why Jesus ends with one final promise. And remember, I am with you always to the end of age. And I don't think that's simply the ending of the Great Commission. I think it's the foundation of it. Because Jesus knew what laid ahead. And the disciples were going to face hardships. They're going to experience setbacks. There's going to be days when they were courageous. And yet there's going to be days when they would be afraid. Days that come easily and days when doubt. Does any of this sound familiar? How many of us live this way? So before any of those ever took the first step, Jesus gave them the promise, I am with you. Not that I'll meet you at the finish line. Good luck. No, I am always with you. Always. Friends, that's all we really need to know. Because honestly, we don't know every mile that's waiting for us. We don't know every detour that we're about to encounter. And we don't know every unexpected step God has planned along the way. But guess what? We do know who walks beside us. Tomorrow morning, people all across Henderson, all across the Vegas area are going to load up their cars. Someone's going to program the GPS, and then someone's going to smile and say, well, let's go. Let's hit the road. But this morning, Jesus says those same words to us. Not because every question has been answered, and not because every mile is going to be easy for us, and not because we're going to get lost along the way. It's because the mountain was never the destination. It was the trailhead. The road where Christ meets us, the road where Christ shapes us. And before we know it, Christ is going to be using us to help shape someone else's life, someone else's journey. So, let's hit the road. And friends, I'm going to be looking for you along the way. Amen? Amen.